All right, everyone, welcome to our live stream, our weekly live stream, hopefully, sort of summarizing the week's events. I figured I would do one of these, hopefully every Friday, to sort of cover on some of the week's newsworthy events in politics. We've got an interesting lineup here today. We're going to talk about Title 42, which was just repealed and replaced with something else. We'll talk about what that is in just a second. We're going to take a look at Prop A, which was rejected by a pretty wide margin in San Antonio, which that was a whole laundry list of progressive policy items. That was rejected in a pretty liberal city. We're going to talk about George Santos' arrest. We're going to talk about some international news, the Tories in the United Kingdom, their losses there and what that probably means for the next general election. We don't usually talk about international news that much on this channel, but I figured it would be interesting considering the fact that there's a lot going on outside the U.S. that I want to cover at some point, and obviously the U.K. is pretty similar politically to the U.S. in the sense that their system is very similar. But, you know, Canada, UK, those sorts of places we'll probably cover in more depth as those things come out. And then we're going to talk about 2024. We're going to talk about Kristi potentially entering the 2024 race and ultimately how the Republican primary stands currently, because as of right now, Donald Trump is the clear front runner. You've got a number of other candidates. You've got Nikki Haley. You've got Vivek Ramaswamy, Larry Elder. So there's a number of other Republicans in the race, but really Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, who Ron DeSantis hasn't declared yet, but once he does, I think that's going to be the real head-to-head to watch, because none of the other Republican candidates really have a chance, in my opinion. I think DeSantis is the only person that could actually beat Trump in a primary. The question of will he is a very different one, and as of right now, Trump has a monumental lead in national and state polls as it stands, but I want to stress that primaries are much more versatile and unpredictable than general elections. You know, at this point back in 2007, you had Barack Obama miles behind Hillary Clinton, who was supposed to be the heir apparent for the Democratic Party that year. So certainly a lot can change, but those are all things we're going to talk about throughout this live stream. So if you want to leave comments or super chats, we'll probably get them to the end. I'm probably going to get through the rundown first, and then I'll take a look at what you guys have to say. So if you want to say anything directly to me related to these events, leave a super chat down below or a comment. We'll try and get to it. So first we're going to talk about Title 42, which was gone away with. It was repealed. Now, Title 42 was not a law. It was a public health order that was started during the Trump administration, which effectively said that migrants crossing the border could be expelled without process because of the threat of COVID or any sort of pathogen. This was introduced really in the 1940s, but it was utilized under the Trump administration to sort of dial back a lot of these asylum claims. And immigration plummeted during 2020, 2021 because we had these rules in place. And now that they're gone, many migrants have felt emboldened to come to the southern border and take advantage of what they see as an easier path to getting into the country. So obviously the border has been a political mess for a long, long time. I mean, really going back to the 1950s with Eisenhower, there's been just massive problems at the border. Of course, the issue of illegal immigration is forefront. But Title 42 really was something that helped deter a lot of asylum seekers from coming to the U.S. in the first place, because if you've paid attention at all to U.S. politics, the border is a total mess right now, and you've got a massive overflow of applications of people trying to get in. You've got illegal crossings. You've got millions trying to enter the country legally, and it's just caused a whole lot of mayhem for numerous administrations. So Title 42, which was introduced back in 1944, allows the government to hold entry to people and imports in order to prevent the introduction of communicable diseases. Of course, Trump used COVID as the communicable disease to really dial back these asylum claims, and basically was allowed the U.S. government was allowed to expel these people who crossed illegally without going through the necessary processes of, you know, processing them, getting them out of the country. It made things a lot easier. Now, one of the flaws in Title 42 was that because this was a health order and not it wasn't immigration policy, there were no penalties involved. So these people would just be sent back. Title 8, which is something the Biden administration is trying to introduce after Title 42, is going to deter, its hopes rather, is to deter migrants from getting into the country, because Title 42 only sent migrants back. It couldn't actually impose any penalties on them because it was a health order, it wasn't a legally binding policy, whereas Title 8 is actually immigration policy, and that's what the Biden administration is deterring to. Now, the reason Biden's even talking about immigration in Title 42 is because Republicans, specifically in the House Republicans, have made a huge deal about illegal immigration, and rightfully so, considering the fact of the amount of people trying to cross over and enter the country over the past couple months because they knew Title 42 was going to sunset. And originally, Biden wasn't going to keep Title 42. He kept it past 2021 into 2022, and now he's letting it expire because he's getting rid of the COVID-19 emergency order entirely throughout the whole government, which includes Title 42. So the only reason that Title 42 stayed as long as it did was because Republicans wanted to keep this policy in place because it helped out Border Patrol a whole lot in getting through a lot of frivolous asylum claims and giving them an easy reason to get them out of the country and focus more on illegal crossings. So Title 8 is likely to replace this. And again, immigration is always sort of a big issue when it comes to presidential elections. We saw that in 2016, especially. 2020 less so. That was mostly COVID and the economy. But, the economy is always number one when you're talking about a presidential election. But immigration, Trump's team and probably the DeSantis people as well are going to try to make Title 42's expiration a big part of their immigration message and hammering Biden on perceived weakness at the border, because this is a potent issue to hit Biden on, and a lot of people, including Democrats in border cities and other areas, are very nervous about this policy going away because it's made the lives of Border Patrol so much easier in the fact that they don't have to go through a whole bunch of processes to kind of get these immigrants processed and out of the country. So, in summary, this is going to lead to a whole lot of chaos at the border. You're already seeing it. There's tons of videos online of migrants, Border Patrol agents, military, National Guard troops being sent to the border to try and quell crowds of thousands of people lining up at the border to gain entry. So, unless there is a tough border policy in the country, you're going to see things like this continue. You saw this with the caravan back in 2018. Thousands and thousands of migrants trying to overwhelm the system in hopes of trying to get in and exploit all of the chaos. You're just going to see more and more of this unless you get really tough on border policy and immigration as a whole. So now we're going to take a look at Prop A. This occurred in San Antonio, which is not a conservative city by any means. It's a very progressive city. But it rejected this charter amendment called Prop A, which was rejected 72-28, which had a laundry list of progressive wish list items. I mean, this had decriminalization of marijuana, decriminalization of abortion, ban on chokeholds, more police oversight. I think it lowered certain lower level offenses to misdemeanors as opposed to felonies, and, kind of kept a lot of criminals out of jail. The whole point was really to be sort of a criminal justice virtue signal, the things that Democrats have been wanting to pass in a lot of major cities for a long time. They have passed in places like California. They've tried to pass policies like this in New York to sort of lower the penalties for lower level offenses in hopes to keep people out of jail. Now, the problem with this is this just emboldens criminals to commit more offenses naturally. So as you've sort of seen a lot of these progressive policies backfire in a number of cities. Chicago, you had a really close mayoral race there. Lori Lightfoot came a distant third in her primary. She got 16% of the vote. And, she was famous for sort of touting these soft on crime policies that progressives like her had sort of perpetuated for a long time. Same thing happened in LA back in 2022. You even had progressives like the Young Turks, Cenk Uygur, who is no conservative by any means, backing Caruso, who was a former Republican who basically just switched to Democrat to run for this mayoral seat and came really close to actually beating Karen Bass in that. So Prop A, this amendment, again, was just a laundry list of progressive policy goals. They wanted to ban chokeholds, no-knock warrants. They wanted to create a justice director who would sort of be an oversight to the police and essentially micromanage all of their practices. Now, of course, this would hamstring police. This would cause a whole lot of bureaucratic nightmares when it came to police just using the basic amount of force they have to use throughout the execution of their duties every day. So, the fact that Prop A was rejected in San Antonio means that Democrats, even some liberals and progressives, are realizing that this sort of approach to soft on crime, moving away from locking up criminals, is very dangerous. And it's been proven dangerous in a number of cities where you've seen crime skyrocket. And, progressive Democrats didn't have the solutions to actually prevent these from happening. They thought that making less things a crime would make people less likely to commit criminal offenses. And all it did was really cause millions of dollars in losses for various stores that were being robbed, assaults going up, murders going up, all sorts of nasty crimes going up. And, San Antonio rejecting this amendment proves that you don't have to be in a conservative area. You don't have to be in a Republican area. It doesn't have to be a partisan issue to maintain law and order in the country. And, you've seen this all in cities all across the country. Seattle had that district attorney's race back in 2021. They elected a Republican DA over a Democratic DA who wanted to basically dismantle the police department, have social workers come to the scenes of violent crimes where they believe somebody was in mental distress. All sorts of nonsense that really would have just made the community less safer. So the fact that San Antonio is doing this, the fact that other progressive cities across the country are doing this, really goes to show you that a lot of Democrats on the issue of crime are grossly out of touch with where mainstream voters actually are. And, New York had a very close governor's race last year, partly because crime had just gotten so out of control in the city, especially in the subways. You had that incident in the subway recently with Jordan Neely. We're not going to cover it in this video, but perhaps we'll talk about it in a future one if there's some updates in that case. But you just have tons of cases of people, a lot of times in mental distress, attacking people, becoming homeless, becoming a danger to society as a result. And, the fact that we have these long-term mental institutions that have been shut down across the country, which has led to all of these homeless all over the place, has really made people a lot less safe. So the fact that Prop A failed rather, and the criminal justice movement lost in this case was a victory for public safety overall. Now, the yes campaign for Prop A actually was vastly outspent by the no campaign. A lot of the police unions, public safety interest groups put millions of dollars into making sure this amendment failed. It was also a low turnout election, but there's no doubt that even in a high turnout situation, I think voters in San Antonio would have rejected this. Now, there was so many different elements to this charter amendment. I mean, you had the decriminalization of abortion. Some people took this as a pro-life victory, that San Antonio wanted to go against, essentially, the progressive narrative on abortion. But it really wasn't so much that San Antonio is now a pro-life city because they rejected an amendment to decriminalize abortion. They rejected a pork barrel amendment that had 12 other things in it, many of which were going to keep them less safe. So that's really why you saw Prop A fail in San Antonio. It wasn't really a pro-life thing. It had nothing to do with decriminalization of marijuana. This was about safe streets, making sure the cops could do their jobs, and ultimately a backlash from people in urban areas to soft on crime policies that have made basically everybody less safe all across the country. And this sort of crime that's been allowed to run rampant in the cities has also spread to suburbs. And it's become a massive issue. Again, like as I said, in New York, which is a very, very blue state, Biden won New York by 23 points. You had a huge backlash to these policies, the policies of DAs like Alvin Bragg, in the almost election of Lee Zeldin. I mean, Lee Zeldin got just shy of 47% of the vote in a state where Republicans barely cracked 40%. And, against an incumbent governor who wasn't the most unpopular. Again, she was unfavorable, but she wasn't an incredibly unpopular governor. You had somebody like Zeldin building an urban coalition, suburban coalition, getting rural voters out, and you really almost maxed out Republican turnout in a state that really shouldn't have been competitive at all on paper. So, crime is a winning issue for Republicans. In fact, there's a lot of winning issues for Republicans. Crime, education. The only major issue that is a losing issue for Republicans is abortion. Gun rights even is a winning issue for Republicans when those proposals are put together. Even in blue states like Oregon, states that are more gun friendly, even though they're blue states, these policies are popular among the general population. And I think polls on things like assault weapons bans are very misleading because while polls say one thing, the voters say another. So polls don't really mean a lot. Again, they're a gauge of public opinion. But really all that matters is what people are actually voting for at the ballot box. And things like Prop A, when people can directly vote on certain issues, you sometimes get very surprising results. So next we're going to talk about the arrest of George Santos, the New York representative from New York's 3rd Congressional District, which is on Long Island. Democratic district. Biden won this district by 8 points. This is a seat Democrats are probably likely to pick up at this point, but this was really inevitable anyway, considering the fact that any Republican running for this seat, whether it's Santos or somebody else, of course, is going to be dealing with the baggage of George Santos. So any Republican's going to have that drag on their ticket. But, looking at all of this, I think he was charged with 13 counts of criminal wrongdoing, devised and executed a scheme of fraud, wire fraud was one of the charges, telling mistruths, which doesn't mean lying. It means basically you're criminally liable for things you say in a certain context, certain lies you tell. Again, George Santos was caught embellishing his resume pretty openly when he ran back in 2022. Nobody really caught him on it until after his election, before he took office, and then it sort of became this whole media storm. So, I'm actually really surprised that his Democratic opponent and their Oppo research team really didn't find this. I guess it was because this race didn't really get a whole lot of attention, and I don't think the team was really digging much through his history, but this guy basically lied about every aspect of his life. He had an alternate alias, Anthony DeValder. He had ties to Brazil. He was living in Brazil for a while. Then he was in New York. He said he was straight when he wasn't. He was married to a woman. All sorts of just weird things about him. He said he worked for Goldman Sachs. He didn't. Said he had this pet charity that he didn't have. On and on and on. He said his mom was in 9/11, died in 9/11 or something like that. So he's basically made up every single thing about his biography possible. He finally got nabbed on it. Republicans and Democrats alike have come out after George Santos because honestly he's become a huge liability and embarrassment for them. Now, Santos actually plays the political game very well because, of course, he's going with sort of the Trumpian narrative that all the legal charges against him are a witch hunt, that these are false charges, they're politically motivated, and, to a certain base of supporters, when he comes out in favor of certain policies that are Trump-like policies, they see this as a political persecution, whereas I think the vast majority of general election voters just see this as a guy who's committed a number of criminal offenses and is being held accountable for them. But, again, he's very much a showman in that sense, being able to sort of drum this up as a political persecution, and to a small number of Americans, that'll resonate with them, because he's made various comparisons to Donald Trump and the indictments going on with him, and trying to say that he's also innocent in this case. Now, of course, he's going to fight this battle. I think he's still in the House. The House hasn't expelled him yet. The Nassau District Attorney, which is the county he lives in, has doubled down on these charges, says they're going to get him on this stuff. But, everyone knew this was coming, I think, once he falsified, or came out that he falsified all these aspects of his biography. I think many people know that the gavel was going to come down on Santos eventually. Now, he's pleaded not guilty, so of course there's going to be a whole court proceeding about this. We're not going to know what happens for quite a while. But the House of Representatives very well might expel George Santos in the near future, especially since he's facing federal fraud charges, and he really isn't able to get his job done as a congressman while he's dealing with all these legal woes. And of course, he's also committed these crimes in general. So will be interesting to see what happens ultimately with New York 3. Again, I think any Republican running for this seat is going to have a real difficult job, considering the fact that Santos is going to be a negative drag on the ticket, just because any Republican is going to be tied to him. Maybe his Democratic opponent, George Zimmerman, or Robert Zimmerman rather, will run again. We'll have to see. But ultimately, again, Santos is probably going to continue sort of this profitable persona of, declaring this as a witch hunt, yada, 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 as other people in Trump world have done, and hoping it works for him. Now, of course, some of the other people aren't facing the same charges he is, so it's a little bit different. But he's hoping to sort of get the partisanship up, get his base behind him, so that he's always going to have people that are going to support him, even if he's in jail and has a way to make money and connections. So will be interesting to see what happens to Santos. Obviously, we're going to talk about it in a future one of these sort of live streams. Now, shifting gears a little bit, we're actually going to move to the UK and talk about the local elections there, because this was a pretty big story when it happened. It's about 6 days ago, so we're coming on about a week. But the Conservative Party in the UK, which has governed the country since 2010, saw massive losses in the local council elections just a week ago. Now, to compare these to U.S. politics, I guess you could compare these to midterm elections. They're basically these large-scale local elections that sort of serve as an indicator before the next general election as to which party is likely, going to improve and do better in the next general election. Obviously, there's been historical precedent for this. The Conservatives did very well, I think, in 2009 in these England council races, and that, of course, was before 2010 when David Cameron and the Conservatives took power in the UK. So the fact that Labour had a pretty impressive showing sort of bodes well for them. Again, it's honestly not so much that Labour had the best showing, but it was more the fact that the Conservatives had an awful showing, because you had the Liberal Democrats, which, if you're not familiar with UK politics, is another sort of center-left progressive party. They gained 407 seats. The Labour Party gained 537. So the Labour Party really only gained 137 seats more than the Liberal Democrats did. The Green Party also did well. Essentially, every party that wasn't the Conservatives, and I guess the Independents, did exceptionally well in these races. Now, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of the UK, has sort of downplayed the significance of these losses, but they're really massive, especially when you compare the fact that the last time there was local elections, I believe when Theresa May was Prime Minister, the Conservatives also lost around 1,000 seats. So many people thought they were almost near their floor then, and that the Conservatives were only going to lose about 400, 500 seats in these local elections. Turns out they lost over 1,000. So currently they're at 1,063 seats. And I think all the council seats are reporting. But, this is obviously disastrous news for a party that has governed the UK since 2010. And, a lot of voters are frustrated with the Conservatives because, quite frankly, the country is headed in the wrong direction. I mean, there's been a lot of conservative promises that have been disregarded by a number of prime ministers. Immigration has only gotten worse in the UK. Illegal immigration, the migrant crisis. Conservatives campaigned as early as 2010, although not as strongly as they did under Boris Johnson, that they were going to get immigration under control, get the border under control in the UK. And ultimately that didn't happen. The economy is imploding right now. You've had a rapid succession of prime ministers over the past few years. You had Theresa May, then you had Boris Johnson for, I believe, 2 years, maybe 3. I think it was 2 or 3 years. Then you had Liz Truss, who I think only lasted about 40 some odd days. And then you have Rishi Sunak as the Conservative prime minister. So you have a massive amount of infighting in the Conservative Party, a massive amount of dysfunction, coupled with the fact that they aren't able to govern competently, at least according to the voters of the UK. And these elections really reflect that. Now, some people have used English politics as sort of a gauge into the future of what American politics will look like, considering the fact that the UK and the Americans politically, culturally are sort of cousins. But I really don't think there's a massive similarity. Again, the Conservative Party in the UK is very different than the Republican Party. The Conservatives are a lot closer ideologically to the Democratic Party, really, and the Labour Party is more akin to other socialist parties around the world, or far center-left sort of parties. So there's not really much of a correlation here, but, the UK is having a general election, I believe, in the next 2 years, 2025 potentially, maybe next year, I'm not 100% sure, but it looks very likely, if these local races are any indication, that the Labour Party is probably going to do incredibly well in the next general election. Keir Starmer, who sort of modeled himself as sort of a Tony Blair, Bill Clinton type of liberal, who sort of has working class appeal in a lot of the areas that the Labour Party has done very poorly in, the white working class. You're sort of seeing very similar political trends in the UK as you're seeing in the US. Suburban areas in the UK, middle class homeowners, they're sort of drifting a little bit more left, or at least away from the Conservatives. The Conservatives are making inroads with the white working class areas that have traditionally voted Labour, but have been sort of turned off by a lot of the social progressivism. You could say the same thing about the U.S. and the Rust Belt, with a lot of the Rust Belt voters in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, who are ancestral Dems. They voted Democrat for nearly a generation, but now they're sort of shifting marginally anyway in the Republicans' direction. So there's many similarities there. And this is also a trend to a lesser extent you're seeing in Canada as well. So obviously a very good sign for Labour. Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister of Great Britain, is going to have a lot of work to do, especially since I think he's still trailing Labour by double digits in the polls towards the next general election in order to make up that ground. Now, he has been making up ground. The question is, can he make up enough ground? That really remains to be seen. So with those other news items out of the way, we're finally going to get to talking about 2024, which is a topic on a lot of people's minds, including mine, especially the primaries, since the primaries are really heating up, especially on the Republican side, because the Democratic side, you really don't have a competitive primary. I mean, you've got Robert Kennedy Jr., who, in my opinion, is really not a serious candidate. I mean, he's polling incredibly high, but I don't really think primary polls this early out are a good indication of where the electorate actually is. You know, RFK is sort of a classical liberal, but then he's super anti-vax, which is, you know, very much against what most Democrats think about the vaccine. Sort of a conspiracy guy. You honestly would think he'd be running in the Republican Party, but he's running as a Democrat, I guess trying to gobble up some of those Trump-Biden voters, those sort of swing Democratic voters that are still Democrats, but they're willing to vote for other candidates. I don't think he's going to go anywhere. I think if Biden wants the nomination, he has it. Barring a serious health crisis or massive legal difficulties for Joe Biden, he's going to be the Democratic nominee. He's going to be renominated. I don't think Kamala Harris or anybody else is going to be in the White House before the 2024 election. And really, Democrats' best bet is Joe Biden. I mean, he's already won back in 2020. It was a narrow race, but he won. He was able to beat Trump in these places where Hillary Clinton performed very poorly, the Rust Belt, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. But he also made inroads in places like Georgia, Arizona, these Sun Belt states that are ancestrally Republican, have voted Republican for a generation, now shifting in favor of the Democrats, mainly because suburbs in general are shifting in favor of the Democrats. And, you know, that's a trend that somebody like Donald Trump sort of exacerbates and makes worse because he's very toxic to suburban voters, whether you like it or not. 2016 proved that. He had a massive falling away from Romney's suburban numbers. Now, the rural areas were able to bail out Trump back in 2016. There was enough rural support and just enough suburban support that Trump was able to squeak by in a lot of these Rust Belt states. But I think 2024 is going to be a very different story because in 2024, people's minds are already going to be made up about Donald Trump. I mean, quite frankly, people's minds were made up about Donald Trump by 2020. He's got a ceiling of around 47% in the popular vote. Electorally, of course, we can go through some of the math in a little bit, but he has a very tough path to 270, in my opinion. And I'll make a video on that sometime down the road because he's likely to be the Republican nominee, and I think Republicans are going to have a really tough time actually winning back the White House if he is at the top of the ticket because unlike in 2016 where Trump sort of had positive coattails in a sense, he's not going to have positive coattails in 2024. I think especially given the fact that he's viewed very unfavorably. He's more unfavorable than Biden. It puts him in a really difficult spot. So in 2024 news, I wanted to talk about Kristi potentially running for the White House and ultimately what purpose that would actually serve because I think Kristi is smart enough to know he's not going to be the Republican nominee. I don't think his purpose is to get in this race and unseat Donald Trump and become the Republican nominee for president. I think it's more likely that Kristi is getting into this race to try and torpedo Donald Trump and make way for another Republican, Ron DeSantis, a Nikki Haley type. At least that's his thinking. Now, how realistic is that? That's a totally other story. But he's trying to go into this race, in my opinion, to basically just stop Donald Trump from being the nominee in 2024 because really after 2020, Trump and Kristi's relationship really soured, especially after January 6th, Trump and Kristi's relationship really soured. And his purpose in this race is just to torpedo Trump. Now, Kristi has attacked both Trump and DeSantis throughout the past couple of months. He's been very opposed to what DeSantis is doing against Disney, sort of taking away their special tax-exempt status which he argues isn't conservative. I would argue that's more of a privilege to have a tax status like that. And if DeSantis and the government and the people of Florida want to get rid of that, that's totally within their purview to do so. But nonetheless, he's defended his previous support for Trump. He said the line was crossed during 2020 when he said the election was stolen. And of course, the fallout from that the next year really didn't bode well for Trump, nor really any Republican. Now, he also went on to sort of rebuke Trump's current campaign strategy, at least in his opinion, of being about retribution and relitigating 2020. Now, there's certainly an argument to be made that that's what Trump is running on. A big part of his message, and we'll talk about the town hall in a little bit, actually, but a big part of the 2024 message is that 2020 was stolen. This is my rightful position as president. I deserve to be president again. Biden's destroyed the country. That's Trump's message to the primary voters in the Republican primary. And so far, according to polling, it's been effective. I mean, if we take a look at the polls right now, Trump is up 31%, according to Real Clear Politics. 538, he's up by 30 points. The average has him 30.5. That's a monumental lead in the Republican primary polling. Now, one thing I'll say, DeSantis is basically stuck at around 22% as of late. DeSantis has not led in a single primary poll against Trump since February. I really think the indictment of Trump really catapulted, I think, his primary numbers because it galvanized the base around him. You sort of had this rally around the flag effect where Republican voters who may not have liked Trump's antics, may not have liked the things he said on Truth Social about other Republicans, but, once they saw something like this happen, their support sort of coalesced around Trump because even if they might not be happy with Donald Trump, they're much more angry with the left and the Democrats and what they've done to Trump over his entire term. So, again, he's up massively in the primary polling. I think Kristi's job in this race really is to try and take down Donald Trump. That's what he wants to do. So we're going to talk about the town hall now. Now, I watched the CNN town hall the other night, shortly after it aired. And there's a lot of things I want to talk about in that because it really was Trump's first sort of mainstream appearance after 2020, after 2021 and all that. So really before that, Trump had been essentially isolated by just about everybody. He was kicked off of traditional media. He was kicked off Facebook. He was kicked off Twitter, kicked off YouTube. He was banned on basically every social media platform. And a lot of the public didn't really hear a lot about him, except some of the late night truths he would put out, at 3 a.m. or something like that. So most voters really didn't hear a lot from Trump. This was the first opportunity for the mainstream American audience to sort of see Donald Trump again, hear his policies. And honestly, it went as I would predict, to be honest. Now, obviously, CNN is hostile territory for Trump. I think everybody knew going in that the moderators were going to grill Trump on 2020, the recent sexual assault lawsuit, the civil case, not a criminal case, it was a civil case, against him, January 6th. Everyone knew that these were going to be the topics for the town hall. I mean, this is CNN. This is the issues. These are the issues, rather, that their audience is focused on. But, this was held in New Hampshire. This is an important primary state. It was 90 minutes, anchored by Caitlin Collins, who I think, funny enough, was actually on Tucker Carlson's crew sometime way, way back in the day. And, most of her questions were about 2020, January 6th, all that sort of stuff. So we're going to get into some of the bullet points from the town hall. But essentially, when they asked him about 2024, he said he didn't commit to actually accepting the results of 2024. Of course, he obviously said that 2020 was unfair to him. That's something he's parroted really since before the election, since COVID, when you saw a lot of these mail-in initiatives instituted all across the country in mostly blue states, but you also saw it in a couple of red states as well, Arizona, which has used mail-in balloting for a long time. And interestingly enough, before 2020, mail-in balloting in a lot of states actually favored Republicans disproportionately because it was usually utilized by older people that, weren't really able to vote on election day. They couldn't get to a polling place, but they were able to fill out a mail-in ballot from their kitchen table, send it in 2 weeks before, and, perform their civic duty that way. So mail-in balloting was not always this democratic advantage that it is now. I mean, Trump sort of turned it into a Democratic advantage. Democrats marketed mail-in balloting very heavily throughout the 2020 election, 2022 especially, which is one of the reasons why Republicans underperformed massively in the 2022 midterms. But Trump saying this isn't a surprise. You know, this is really quote-unquote classic Trump, if you will. Of course, Trump's not going to ever accept defeat. He's always going to deflect and say it was somebody else. So that was pretty typical. You know, Trump called the moderator a nasty woman. That's, you know, just something Trump does, I guess. Trump called overturning Roe a great victory, which I think from a Republican standpoint was really smart because obviously the vast majority of Republicans are pro-life. They supported the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But he dodged the federal abortion question, which I actually think out of all the topics in the town hall, Trump actually did the best on abortion because he didn't commit to doing anything federally, which I think is smart because really when you think about it logically, the conservative argument against Roe v. Wade for the longest time was that abortion needed to be left up to the states. So when you make abortion a federal issue, not only does it make the Republicans look hypocritical and overreaching, but that now makes a lot of liberals in swing and blue states who otherwise could have abortions very worried that they're not going to be able to have abortions anymore. And that's one of the reasons why in 2022 you saw a massive turnout among Gen Z, women in particular, who turned out in a lot of these states where Republicans ran very suboptimal candidates, Mastriano in PA, Tudor Dixon in Michigan, John Gibbs in Michigan on the House level, Joe Kent. You know, the list goes on and on. But, you know, that's certainly a losing issue for Republicans. But look, Trump argued that getting rid of Roe v. Wade certainly leveled the playing field on the abortion topic because really for the past 50 years, the liberal narrative on abortion has won. You know, the pro-choice side had their way with Roe v. Wade, which essentially said that you couldn't regulate abortion before the point of viability, which is actually the opinion of mainstream Americans. So when you take that away, swing voters who are more inclined to vote Republican but aren't really pro-life get kind of worried about that. And of course, they come out and vote for Democrats. Now, Republicans had about a month between the court leak, that Supreme Court leak from one of the clerks that basically said Roe v. Wade was going to be repealed with the Dobbs decision, and the actual repealing of Dobbs to actually come up with some good strategic messaging on this topic. You know, a message that stayed true to the Republican Party's position, but also didn't alienate swing voters and liberals and sort of scaring them into saying that, you know, they were going to outlaw abortion from the moment of conception federally in blue states, purple states, and red states alike. Now, while many Republicans would like to do that, it's not politically viable by any means. And honestly, when you parrot that sort of rhetoric, you make the possibility of abortion going away in America just more improbable because Republicans can't do anything on the issue of abortion if they can't even win elections. So from a strategic standpoint, it's a terrible idea. Obviously, they talked about Jean Carroll. You know, Trump had some classic Trump moments with that. He arguably might have defamed her a bit more. At least that's what she's arguing. But, you know, he obviously denies it. You know, he denied it during the deposition tapes he had. And of course, he denied it during the town hall. CNN wasn't going to really give Trump a break on anything. They were going to ask him tough questions. And some could argue unfair questions because they're CNN. That's what they're going to do. You know, any Republican that goes into the arena on CNN is in hostile territory. They're going to have to be on their A game. And it honestly could have gone a lot worse for Donald Trump. I mean, he appeared like classic Trump. You could argue that's not really viable in a general election anymore. But for primary voters, they got everything they wanted out of Donald Trump. Trump was forthright. He was on offense against CNN, Jean Carroll, all these people. And, you know, it presented good optics. And, you know, for a lot of the Trump influencers, they're already out on Twitter and on other platforms saying the primary is over. You know, this CNN primary sealed the deal for Trump's nomination. And I certainly think that's a lot of wishful thinking for a lot of people because not a lot of people outside of Trump world saw the town hall. Obviously, media folks did. Obviously, CNN viewers did. But the fact of the matter is, Trump is still wildly unpopular in America. That's just a fact by general election voters. So if Trump is going to win 2024, He needs to do a massive PR overhaul, which I don't really think is possible at this point because so many swing voters have already made up their mind about Donald Trump. And of course, it puts the Republicans in a huge quandary because Trump has such a loyal and fanatical base that will never leave him no matter what. And this base is now swaying Republican primaries left and right. You know, these are the type of people that got Doug Mastriano elected in Pennsylvania, nominated in Pennsylvania, rather. These are the people that got Kari Lake nominated in Arizona. John Gibbs nominated in Michigan. So in a lot of these states where Republicans had a much better shot with a different candidate, this part of the base, the MAGA Trump base, swung the primaries in their favor. And then, of course, 2022 was sort of a referendum on what general election voters actually thought of those candidates. And a lot of it wasn't even based on their policies. It was some of the rhetoric they were espousing, mainly on abortion and mainly on 2020. Most voters, the vast majority of voters, don't want to hear anything about 2020 anymore. They don't want to relitigate it. It's over. It's done with. Even Republicans that think that it was unfair really shouldn't be talking about it because, quite frankly, they're not appealing to anybody outside of, our plus 30 districts in the middle of Texas or the Great Plains or something like that. So, my advice to Republicans on the election issue is just to, increase their operation when it comes to mail-ins, increase early voting, tell their voters to actually vote early and by mail because, if you're somebody who thinks mail-in voting and early voting needs to be done away with, you can't do away with the voting unless you actually win these elections. And, it's given Democrats a huge advantage because one of the problems Democrats have had for so long is that their voters just don't turn out. So if you give them an easy way to turn out via mail-in voting, they're going to turn out and they're going to vote for their candidates. So that's something that wasn't available during the Obama years back in 2010, back in 2014, and Republicans won massively in all those midterms. So Republicans need to get with the program, so to speak, adopt mail-in, tell their voters to vote early because they're not going to win any of these states. They're not going to win Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, by dodging mail-in and just telling their people to vote early, vote in person, because you have things like what happened in Arizona where you had a lot of problems with the in-person voting. And, obviously Republicans are crying foul, but the only thing I could say to that is Republicans should have voted early to begin with, because you can't set aside one day where anything could happen, anything could stop you from voting, as the only day for your base to vote, because guess what? Things like Arizona happen, problems happen. And, that's something Republicans are going to have to contend with. And the way to do that is by adopting mail-in voting. So, again, Trump has talked more about it. You've got some crazies around Trump, like Mike Lindell, who have sort of tried to steer him away from mail-in voting, which I think is totally ridiculous because Trump has 0% chance at winning the election if Republicans aren't embracing mail-in voting. Because, like it or not, mail-in voting is here to stay for the short term, at least till 2024. Republicans missed their opportunity to fix this back in 2022, when, again, they should have utilized mail-in voting. But regardless, if the laws are going to change, Republicans actually need to win state legislatures back. They've got to win state legislatures in a lot of these swing states back. They lost the state house in Pennsylvania. They lost the House and Senate in Michigan. They still hold the House in Arizona, Georgia, but it's pretty narrow, I think, in Arizona especially. So change really begins at the state level. It doesn't begin so much at the federal level. 2022 was supposed to be laying the groundwork for Republicans to win in 2024, and ultimately that didn't come to fruition at all. So it's been really depressing to see the lack of insight and reflection for Republicans in the fact that they're not looking at the mistakes they made in 2022 and correcting for 2024. Because while they talk a big game about, we're going to invest this much in early voting, the RNC really isn't interested in changing business as usual. And that's really how politics works in this country. Business as usual, the status quo. These are things that people want to keep. And I don't think anybody is really going to make any significant changes unless they work within that system. So, he talked about Mike Pence. I think that was honestly a really bad moment from Trump when he basically said he shouldn't have apologized to Mike Pence because Pence didn't have the authority to change the results of the election. And, the fact that you had people chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," and Trump basically said, well, I'm not going to apologize because he did something wrong. That was terrible optically. I think it was terrible morally to say. And, Biden's already made attack ads about it. Biden is cutting ads about Trump's January 6 comments, which I think were just dug him a deeper hole. I don't know why he can't shut up about 2020 and January 6, because somebody like Trump, if he had just conceded gracefully in 2020, sort of bowed out, stayed out of the primary process in 2022, and then said, I'm going to run in 2024, you wouldn't have the prospects of somebody like DeSantis running. You wouldn't have Republicans frantic about the fact that their nominee, who was the former president who lost, is probably going to lose again, and they want to sort of change course. You wouldn't have had that. I think you would have had a much more united front around Donald Trump. You probably would have had people like Asa Hutchinson and Larry Elder still running, but I mean, what are they going to get, 2% of the vote? I mean, Trump would have probably crushed in that primary with somewhere between 70, 80% of the vote. But now, really because of his own actions, you've got a competitive primary on the Republican side. And he's going to have to fight for it. This is not 2020's primary. I don't care what the polls say now. Trump is going to have to fight for the nomination. He's not going to get the red carpet like he did back in 2020. 2016 was a little different. He wasn't an incumbent, but he is an incumbent now, and he's polling below 60% in a lot of cases. Now, obviously I'm not going to argue with what we're seeing so far. It's very clear that Trump is the favorite as of now. But my point is, a lot can change. It's May of 2023. It's very premature to say DeSantis is out of the race. He has no chance at the nomination. That very well could be true, but I just don't think it's very wise to say something like that a year and a half before the general election, because so many things can change. I mean, take a look at what happened in 2022. And I had a ton of bad takes on 2022 because I really just didn't see the bigger picture. But in 2022, you had one major event sort of coupled with primary meddling by Trump, but you had one major event that really changed the landscape for the midterms, and that was Roe v. Wade and abortion. Abortion was a non-issue in terms of 2022. Nobody was really talking about it. It had no weight because nothing was really happening on that front. And then all of a sudden, Roe v. Wade goes away, and you've got a super energized Democratic base, and Republicans are on defense, and then you've got Trump, who, in backing his candidates that were popular with the base, those candidates ended up hurting Republicans' chances all across the country. I mean, you had Dr. Oz, who, I personally liked. I helped him in that campaign, but, I mean, let's be honest, he wasn't the best fit for Pennsylvania. I mean, he's a Turkish millionaire who basically landed in Pennsylvania just a couple of years before and decided to run for Senate. Wasn't really good optics. Again, he was a charismatic guy, but he didn't really resonate with the people of Pennsylvania. Coupled that, of course, with the fact that he was on the ballot with Doug Mastriano, who could be perhaps one of the worst Republican candidates ever run in recent memory. You have a recipe for disaster, and this was the case all around the country. You had these candidates, in many cases, almost all cases, Trump-endorsed candidates that, and it wasn't just because Trump endorsed them. I don't think that was really what killed them. It was their style, their optics, the rhetoric they were espousing, not even so much their policies, but the fact that a lot of them couldn't shut up about 2020, couldn't shut up about a total ban on abortion. So all of these things kind of culminated in a very disappointing midterm for Republicans. And I made a video some months back talking about 2022 and what happened there, and I kind of want to make a more detailed autopsy at some point soon, even though I know 2022 was like 6-7 months away now. Or in the past, rather. But I do want to talk about it again because I think there's some things in the earlier video that I missed, especially now that we've had time to sort of sit back and sort of take in the bigger picture about what happened. So stay tuned for that, obviously. And I talked a little bit about the classified documents. Of course, Trump defends his right to take them. Biden also had classified documents. Pence had classified documents. That really wasn't an issue for them. But, for Trump, they kind of made it a big issue. And part of the reason was he said he didn't have the documents, and then he did have the documents when they found them. So, he kind of he dug himself that hole, honestly. I mean, he could have just turned over the documents to begin with, but instead said he didn't have them. Then the FBI checked. He did have a bunch of them. Whatever. Pence, Biden, a lot of ex-presidents have documents that they don't realize are classified. It's very common. I really don't think it's going to be a big issue in the primary no matter what, but obviously we'll see what happens. And then the topic of Russia-Ukraine, which was a sort of big one in the town hall. Now, Trump made the position that he really doesn't care who wins the war, whether it's Ukraine or Russia. I want everyone to stop dying, he said. I don't think in terms of winning or losing. I think in terms of getting it settled so we stop killing all these people. Now, I think the problem with this response, just generally from a national security standpoint, is yes, I understand the argument of, let's not send blank checks to Ukraine. That makes a lot of sense. Of course you don't want to do that, especially since the Ukrainian government has a lot of corruption in it. But on the flip side, if Russia takes Ukraine, they're definitely going to take more territory. I mean, this was a decades in the making process of Russia steadily increasing its influence in the former Eastern Bloc and ultimately coming right on the border with NATO. You had Crimea back in 2014. That was the invasion there and the annexation of some lands there. Of course, you had the annexation of Crimea. So this was a surprise, certainly to me, when it happened last year, just because of the fact that I didn't expect it to happen right then and there. But when you had a lot of military intelligence saying Russia was ready to invade Ukraine, I honestly really didn't believe it at first. I thought it was just sort of the fear-mongering you sort of get from mainstream media. But then it happened. And, again, while I don't think we should be sending blank billions and billions of dollars of checks to Ukraine, because that's obviously fiscally irresponsible, Russia taking Ukraine just gives them a stronger position on the world stage to undermine NATO and ultimately the U.S. So that's really why I think it was a tricky situation. And a lot of Republicans in the House and Senate condemned Trump for these comments, ultimately saying that, they were poorly worded. Lindsey Graham, who supports Trump, tried to defend them. So, again, while I don't think it's the best idea, just send blank checks, you can't really let a nation like Ukraine, which was invaded by Russia. I mean, keep it real. It was just taken over. You can't really just let them fend for themselves. Now, I understand the argument of World War III and all that, but there are ways the U.S. can get involved to discourage Russia from taking the whole of Ukraine and preventing conflict. So, again, Trump got a lot of flack for not taking a position. I don't think it's because Trump is some pro-Russia shill or whatever. I just think it's more so the fact that he wants to play both sides because there are Republicans in the base that are, anti-Ukraine, pro-Russia, whatever. So he wants to keep every side happy. So that's really why he made the comments, and ultimately he had a backlash from some Republicans. So that was really this week in summary. I mean, I want to try to do one of these live streams once a week, probably on Friday nights. Again, this was a very spontaneous live stream. I mean, I didn't even come up with the idea to do this until about 6-7 hours ago at the gym. So I literally didn't even think I was going to do a live stream, but I thought it would be fun and interesting to sort of start live streaming, maybe on Friday nights, maybe we'll pick a different night, to sort of go over the week's events previously. Now, the reason I picked Friday and not Thursday or something like that is because Friday's the closest to the end of the week you can get. I mean, streaming on a weekends, one, people are busy, two, you're not going to get a very big audience anyway, and, so we'll try to make this sort of a weekly thing. I mean, I hope to kind of keep it a weekly thing anyway, because I think it's a good way to sort of touch on current events, which I really don't get to touch on in my normal videos because I mostly do election analysis and stuff like that. I mean, I talk about current events sometimes, but I think this is sort of the best way to continually talk about what's going on in the world, outside of my usual content, which usually doesn't cover this stuff because, keep it real, the current event videos on my channel get a lot less views than some of the other content I make. So I figure instead of covering all these different issues in separate videos, which aren't really going to get a lot of people's attention, I would rather just put them in one video, sort of summarize everything that goes on in the week, because also it's easier because it's a lot of work to make 6 videos on things like that when I'd rather talk about the primaries, what's going on in Washington, things like that. So this is sort of a way to cover some of those events that I don't cover in my usual content. So anyway, I'd like to thank you all for coming to this live stream. I guess we'll take a look at some of the comments since we do have a little bit of time. I try to make these videos, or I'm trying rather to make these videos about an hour. So it'll be about an hour stream. And of course, this video will stay up. So if you guys want to watch this video in the future, you can. But we've got some comments here. Echo says, Kristi 2024 is like George Pataki 2016. Very true. I mean, Kristi doesn't have a shot at the nomination. Obviously, George Pataki in 2016 was well past his prime. I mean, he hadn't been in office since 2007. So you're talking about somebody who's out of office for over 9 years. I mean, Kristi hasn't been in office since January of 2018. So, both of these guys have been out of public life for a while. They're really not adding anything to the conversation, I think. I mean, there's nothing really special about Kristi or George Pataki other than the fact that they were Republicans who won governorships in very blue states. And obviously George Pataki was very renowned for his 9/11 response, similar to Mayor Giuliani. The Justifier 556 says, is there a reason you changed your name from Populist New Yorker? Yeah, because I don't consider myself a populist ideologically. I mean, that's really the fundamental line. Plus, I just like the name Empire State Politics a lot better because I'm from the Empire State. I cover politics. I really should try and cover statewide politics more. I want to probably in the future. But again, you narrow your audience quite a bit when you do that because most of my audience are not from New York and aren't familiar with sort of the nitty-gritty of local politics. But maybe I will make sort of like a New York issues sort of series, sort of like what Styx Hexenhammer, if you ever watched him way back in the day, used to do about Vermont, which I honestly thought was really interesting because, I mean, who really thinks about Vermont politics, you know? So I might do something similar with New York politics. Justifier says again, say it wasn't stolen because it's just cope to say it was outright stolen. I mean, yeah, I tend to agree. And obviously, if any of you guys follow my Twitter, you know my opinions on the stolen election narrative. I just think it's total nonsense and a sham. I mean, you could argue, well, the Democrats leveled the playing field in their favor with all the voting laws and mail-in ballots and the no-excuse absentees. And I completely agree. I sympathize. I totally understand. And I really don't think people should be voting 2 months before an election, before you have any debates, you know, before the general election campaign season in some cases is in full sway because some primaries, like in Rhode Island, for instance, are held in September and the general election is less than 2 months away. So I'm totally sympathetic to that idea. And I would just tell Republicans to move on. It's a losing issue. They don't have the evidence on their side. It's really just a massive cope. Again, I think regardless of your opinions, it's an electoral liability. And we saw that in 2022, where you had a lot of the Stop the Steal candidates, the Trump-endorsed candidates, just do really awful in their elections. You know, Christina Caramo, who thankfully, and I say that sarcastically, of course, is the chairwoman of the Michigan GOP. She made her entire campaign on the fact that 2020 was stolen. And, you know, obviously she did very poorly there. So, again, I would just tell Republicans, don't run on that issue. It's not popular. Again, regardless of your opinion on 2020, you know, for Trump, DeSantis, whoever the nominee is, the focus has to be on the future. The focus has to be on Biden. And anything else really is just a distraction. I mean, 2020 just gives the Democrats more of an attack line on Republicans. So, yeah. Definitely an issue I would avoid. A's Highlight said this will be a disaster if Trump's the nominee. I'm honestly growing sick of Trump and Biden and want to move on from both candidates. And a lot of Americans would agree with you. Again, I covered, I think, a couple months ago, a poll. I think it was done actually by The Hill that said over 70% of Americans didn't want Trump or Biden to be the nominee and wanted a fresh Republican and a fresh Democrat. Now, as of now, it doesn't look like that's going to happen. Biden's certainly going to be the Democratic nominee. Trump at this point is likely to be the Republican nominee, so we're very much gearing towards a rematch. You know, Trump wants to pull a Grover Cleveland in the sense that he wants to be a non-incumbent president who lost re-election, who ends up winning in 2024. And, you know, I'm not somebody who thinks Trump will definitely lose 2024. But I've been very critical of Donald Trump and a lot of his antics, especially after 2020. I don't think it's impossible. I think it's unlikely that he beats Biden. But really, it's sort of an uphill battle regardless of who the nominee is, because DeSantis also has his own problems against Joe Biden. Joe Biden's an incumbent. Joe Biden has better numbers in the Rust Belt than somebody like Hillary Clinton ever did. So you've got those things. And of course, DeSantis and Trump both have sort of their own flaws and liabilities. Again, Trump has the suburbs as a liability. You could argue in some respects DeSantis has a problem with some of the diehard MAGA people, which I don't always buy because a lot of these people like both Trump and DeSantis. But you could argue that there's some people that aren't as political that only come out for Trump. But I think the argument you're getting from a lot of the DeSantis supporters is that DeSantis's suburban margins are going to outweigh any gains that Trump would make among non-college educated whites in the rural areas. Buckeye Politics says rough week. Yeah, it's been a very, very interesting week in American news, to say the least. Storm 15 says, do you think North Carolina has the potential to be the next Florida? I mean, North Carolina demographically is very different than Florida. I mean, Florida has a high Latino population, a majority of which is Cuban, which are already voters that tend to vote Republican. So Latinos in Florida are very different than Latinos in North Carolina, and especially Latinos in even Texas. You know, Latinos in Florida are the most Republican voting Hispanic group in the entire country, and that's mostly because you have Venezuelans and you've got Cubans, both of which vote majority Republican. So for North Carolina to be Florida, a number of things would happen. Republicans would need to do better in Charlotte. They'd have to do better in Raleigh. They'd have to do better in the urban, suburban areas, which are areas they've been losing ground before Trump, honestly. I mean, Republicans have been bleeding ground in the suburbs. Really, if you want to go back all the way, it was in Bill Clinton. It was with Bill Clinton in 1992. That's when you sort of had the suburban realignment really start, because before that, you had people like George H.W. Bush winning Montgomery County, PA, which is like a D+30 county now. You had them winning that county by 35 points, 40 points, some ridiculous margin. So these suburbs, which are in some cases centrist, center-left, they're now voting for Democrats over Republicans. And again, this is a problem that predates Trump, although Trump, I would argue, accelerated it quite a bit. But North Carolina GOP honestly has done a really good job, especially given the fact that they don't have the governor's mansion. I mean, they managed to get a supermajority because they've gotten one of the Democrats to switch over, which gave them the supermajority in the state house. Now, that's only going to last until after 2024. I mean, obviously, Republicans could still win a supermajority after 2024, but they have it now, and they probably have to make the most of it because it's do or die, I think, for the North Carolina GOP, because you've got Robinson running for governor in 2024. Obviously, Republicans want him to win. They need him to win, really, if they want to sort of transform North Carolina into the next Florida. And it is interesting that Florida has now become synonymous with sort of this Republican utopia, because Florida is, in my opinion, the model for the Republican vision going forward. I mean, you took a state that voted for Obama twice and now is arguably likely or even solid Republican on the federal level and on the state level. So, you know, Florida had positive demographic trends for Republicans, but you also had conservative leaders in Florida like Ron DeSantis who have made Florida a beacon for conservatism all across the country. Hundreds of thousands of people from blue and purple states have moved to Florida. They've kind of transformed it politically. And, you know, that's something you need if you want to make a state like North Carolina the next Florida. I don't really see that sort of in-migration from blue areas to North Carolina, at least blue areas where the voters are actually voting Republican. I mean, in Florida, a lot of the people fleeing these blue states are Republican voters. They voted Republican wherever they're from, whether it's New York, PA, Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, wherever they're coming from. But in North Carolina, you have more of the tech industry, which is very liberal. So you're going to have a lot of younger liberal voters moving to those suburbs. And that's why you really don't see massive shifts back towards the GOP in North Carolina. Now, the Republicans have room to grow in the rural areas in North Carolina. The exurbs are really populated, but they're going to need a overhaul in their suburban outreach to keep the state, because the suburban areas are growing very fast and the rural areas can't keep up. In fact, the rural areas in some cases are losing population. So if Republicans want to make North Carolina the next Florida, they need a strong governor. I mean, if Robinson was to win, I think he could be that type of governor, but the problem is he's got a lot of problems of his own. He's got a ton of baggage. Now, I made a video about that probably a week ago maybe now. I don't think Mark Robinson is Doug Mastriano. I don't think he's the massive liability that Mastriano was, because he's actually held elected office before statewide. Mastriano never did. He was in a super red state Senate district. So I don't think Robinson is sort of this inept buffoon like Mastriano was, in the sense that Robinson actually knows what to talk about on the campaign trail, and he's proven that he can win statewide. Now, I still think his comments about various groups are going to hurt him in the race. The question is how much. I think he's a lot more savvy than Mastriano was, a lot more charismatic, can raise a lot more money. And ultimately, North Carolina is a much more conservative state than Pennsylvania is socially. So Robinson has all those things going for him. Again, long time away. We don't really know who's going to win that race. I mean, I sort of lean towards Stein just because of, the comments and sort of how I think this race, or how I know this race is going to pan out. You're going to have nonstop ads of Robinson's quotes on gays, on all sorts of various groups, run through suburban Mecklenburg, suburban Raleigh, all these areas that are getting more and more liberal, shifting away from the GOP. That's going to be their MO. That's what they did in Pennsylvania, and it worked. So the difference is, though, Robinson actually can counter it because he can actually raise money. He's not Doug Mastriano. So he can actually put ads countering those attacks, whereas Mastriano, I think, put out his first TV ad in October, which everybody celebrated, but really it was quite pathetic because those TV ads should have been out months and months in advance. All right, so we're going to read the last of the comments, and then I think we're going to wrap it up tonight. It's been fun. Again, I want to try to do these at least once a week, so certainly next Friday we'll have one. The Friday after that's going to be up in the air. I'm not going to be home, so we're probably going to reschedule this sort of live stream for some other date, maybe on Sunday or something like that. We'll figure it out. But Jeff Gessel says, I live in a rural area in Minnesota, and people are fleeing the cities and all the BS that goes on. Well, obviously, you're seeing that everywhere. You're seeing a massive migration away from inner cities because they're just dangerous. They're dangerous. They're unsafe. Nobody wants to live there. Unless you're making a lot of money and you've got a cushy financial job, there's no reason to live in a downtown major city. So you've got a lot of people leaving these areas. In a lot of cases, they're moving to the suburbs, and they're sort of changing the voting patterns there. And, to resonate with those people, you need to make it clear that you don't want the suburbs you came to become like the cities you were fleeing, soft on crime, violence, etc. So I think Republicans can really capitalize on that. They're certainly going to do better with not just white voters, but Latino voters, Asian voters. We saw that in New York, and that's really, I think, the blueprint for Republicans tackling the crime issue, because those issues resonate a lot. Storm 15 says, why on earth do people think Mastriano should run again, even if it's been reported that Trump wants nothing to do with him? And I think that's the really damning thing about Mastriano 2024 is the fact that even Donald Trump wants nothing to do with him, because he knows that Mastriano was part of the reason Oz lost to Fetterman by so much. And he knows that, honestly, it's classic Trump, but it's just a selfish move. He knows that Mastriano being on the ticket is not going to help him win PA. It's only going to hurt him. So, I'm glad. Look, I hope Trump keeps Mastriano out of the race, but I'm not really optimistic about that. We'll see what happens. But yeah, I don't know why Mastriano, after losing by 14 points in a swing state, thinks he has another shot. Especially against somebody like Bob Casey, who would probably beat him by 22 points or something crazy like that. Storm 15 again says, also enjoyed the stream. Look forward to more in the future. Well, absolutely. And of course, a lot of you guys are subscribers watching, but if you're not, please consider subscribing down below. Like this video. Share this stream because it'll still be up even after the live stream ends. So I'll keep these streams up because I want to continue doing these sort of weekly segments, sort of just going all over the political news of the day that we don't get to cover in the main videos. So thank you guys for watching. Again, subscribe, like the video. Hope to see you guys in the next video. Take care. Have a great rest of your evening.